For 2 weeks, what we'll be doing here at church, we'll be talking about the idea of leadership. And there's a reason why we want to talk about leadership both for this week and next week. The main reason being that next Sunday we have our annual meeting where we present many of the leaders of our church. We'll be presenting our new board members, our nominating committee members, our ministry team leaders, kind of a whole dozens of people who make this church what it is. And so it's a good time, I think, for us naturally to be thinking about, okay, what is leadership? As we present leaders, for us to consider what leadership is at the same time. It just makes a lot of sense. And so that'll be part of the reason why we want to talk about leadership. The other reason I want to talk about leadership is that I think that leadership is something that we all engage in, regardless of whether we have that title or not. Because I think oftentimes we make the mistake of thinking of leaders as a certain kind of person, right? That person is a leader, or this kind of person is a leader. But the reality is more exactly that we all lead in certain ways in our lives. That we may not do it as a profession or a job, but we lead other people at certain times in certain spheres of our life. For instance, you may not have a job that you may have to lead, but you probably do, honestly, some of us, right? But you may lead in a community or in a school, in your neighborhood or your family. Parents out there, you are leaders. Even if you stay at home with your children, you are leading 1, 2, 3, in my case, 5 kids into being more like Christ, right? And so we all lead in some aspect of our lives, even if we don't necessarily have that mantle or the identity of being a leader where people call us that. And so I'm hoping that as we talk about leadership, we'll all be able to apply it. Whether we have that title or role or not, that we will look at the ways in which we lead in our lives, whether it's in the workplace or at home, in our communities and neighborhoods, and we'll apply some of the things that we have learned to those spheres of our lives. That leadership is something that we can all learn about and from. So the model that we're going to use to explore leadership for 2 weeks is John 21. John 21, which is the reinstatement of Peter when Jesus restores Peter. And there's a reason why I think this is what I believe the main model of what godly Christian leadership looks like. This, I think, is the purest snapshot of what leadership can look like for a couple of reasons. First off, you have 2 of the main leaders of biblical history present in one moment, speaking directly to each other. Right? You've got Jesus and you've got Peter. This is Jesus in his resurrected glory. This is Jesus after the resurrection. All authority is on him. He's in his resurrected body, speaking to Peter, who will be the father of the early church and will carry the church into its next season, and then ultimately across the world, which will continue on to this very day. Right? There's something amazing happening when the resurrected Messiah and the Father early church are talking about this moment of transition going from the ministry of Jesus to the early church. That is leadership. That's like, world leaders coming together. That's an amazing moment where you see something profound taking place. Another reason why I think John 21 is such a good explanation or a snapshot of leadership is that it's at this moment that Peter becomes the leader of the church. This is the moment that changes him or gives him that identity. And oftentimes we think that Pentecost marks that moment, that it was in Acts 2 that Peter finally becomes the leader of the early church. But when you look in the book of Acts, what you'll recognize is that even by Acts 1, Peter is leading the church. Even by Acts 1, he's leading them to figure out who is going to take Judas' spot in terms of the disciples. So he's already strongly leading the disciples even before the Pentecost. And what that means is that this reinstatement, what happens in John 21, is a pivotal part, a pivotal moment in establishing him as the leader of the early church. Something about the reinstatement establishes him as a true leader for the body of believers. And that's why I think this is a great example for us to learn from and to get some insights into what leadership will look like into our own lives. What's really interesting about the leadership ideas and themes that this passage presents to us is that it really explains to us how different godly leadership is from worldly leadership. That godly leadership is associated with some themes and some ideas that we would never usually associate with leadership. And the first one that we're going to explore all throughout today is forgiveness. That according to John 21, in this snapshot of what true leadership looks like, leadership seems to be connected to the idea of forgiveness. And I think for many of us, that's a really shocking idea. How often, if we're asked to identify traits of leaders or leadership, would we mention forgiveness as one of the most important traits that a leader should have? I would say in my own mind, I would have never brought that up. I would have said charisma, talent, determination, skill, right? Whatever it might be, but I wouldn't say forgiveness is one of the top things that we see. And yet in this moment, where leaders are coming together, where seasons are changing, where Peter is going to be established as the head of the church, what this moment is marked by is forgiveness. Right? This is a moment of forgiveness and leadership going hand in hand, where these two things can't be separated from each other. And so I want to explore this a bit more, and I want us to kind of understand what is the connection between leading in our lives and forgiveness. Why is forgiveness such a big part of leadership in maybe a way that we've never explored or understood in our lives? So 3 insights, 3 reasons why I think forgiveness is necessarily tied to leadership, and I hope that'll affect how we think of leadership. Number 1, the first insight is this, that mistakes do not disqualify us from leadership. Mistakes do not disqualify us from leadership. I would say for many of us, the main way in which we choose to discern leaders is by the mistakes that they make. Right? That if a person makes mistakes, that automatically disqualifies them from being a leader. And the worse that the mistake is, the more reason we have to say, no, you're not a leader because you made that mistake. That's how we think about leadership. That's how we think about leadership, not just in churches, but across the nation. Right? That leadership is directly tied to the mistakes that a person makes. What's really interesting from this passage is that we see something very different. We see in this passage that this is Peter being forgiven of a mistake, that he's made many errors. And it's a pretty bad one that he needs to be restored from because he denies Jesus 3 times, as we see in Luke 22, 60 to 62. In that verse it says, Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. I think for many of us, this would be the grounds to dismiss Peter from leadership. For us to say, I'm sorry, Peter, but look what you did. You boasted that you knew better than me. You rebuked me, and then you denied me 3 times. You have been disqualified for leadership. I think many of us would make that decision. And yet Jesus consciously decides to choose Peter to be the head of the early church. A very similar principle takes place in Paul's life. Paul makes what I think is a worse mistake because he actually decides to participate in the death of believers. He approves as believers are stoned to death. If there is anything that we would use as a marker to say, no, Paul's not going to be a leader, it's killing someone else. Like that truly seems like a disqualifier for ministry. And yet what does God do? God consciously chooses Paul, a persecutor of the church, to become the head of evangelist to the Gentiles who are in the world. And that's an amazing thing, that even though these people have made errors that would disqualify them from what we believe is leadership, God consciously chose them. And so even though we tie leadership with perfection or mistakes hand in hand, and it's one of the main ways that we choose leaders, we have to understand from the example we see in Paul's life, in Peter's life, in David's life, those 2 things are actually separate. In God's mind, mistakes do not necessarily disqualify us from leadership. I know that's really hard because as a leader, that is really hard for me to move into, a reality for me to live into. But that's what we see. We see people who make many errors and many bad errors, and yet they are still allowed to lead at the very highest level in the kingdom of God. And I think that presents a challenge to us. And the challenge is this: are we imposing the world's view of leadership upon others and ourselves? Just ask yourself that question. I had asked myself that question, and I realized it was true. That oftentimes when I think about leaders, I think, no, that person can't be a leader because why? Because they made that mistake. Because they screwed up that one time. Because they screwed up that one time, they can't be a leader. And that was a rebuke to me. To read this passage and to see Jesus forgiving someone who had made a mistake and allowing them to be a leader. And I recognize in my own life that I have to reform this mentality. And I have to stop associating leadership in the church and in the kingdom of God with mistakes, because that's not how God chooses things. But I also realize that we need to stop doing this to ourselves. that there's a good number of us, I think, that we don't necessarily disqualify other people from leadership because of the mistakes that they make. We disqualify ourselves. That we think to ourselves, because I did that, because that happened in my life, I don't want to be a part of the leadership. I shouldn't be able to do that because I made that mistake. I'm that kind of person. I still struggle with this. And again, we're living into that same mentality. It's just the mirror is upon ourselves, right? And we're saying to ourselves, mistakes and leadership are tied together. Therefore, I cannot be a leader because of the mistakes that I have made. I think we need to separate those two ideas. Because then, in God's eyes, in the model of leadership that we see in John 21, mistakes and leadership are not tied together. They are not tied together. And I think that's a really important mentality that we need to shift and dismantle in our lives, the relationship between mistakes and leadership. Now, even as I say that, I can tell some of you are uncomfortable. You're like, oh my gosh, what kind of leaders are we going to select here? And I get uncomfortable with that idea. That mistakes are not the way that we choose leaders. That doesn't mean that there are no standards, though. It doesn't mean that God's like, yeah, anyone can be a leader no matter what, because that's truly not the case. There is a selection process. It's just that mistakes is not the means by which God makes that selection. God doesn't tick off things and say, made a mistake here, 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 therefore 3 strikes and you're out. That's not what God does. But he does have a different way of judging whether our quality and our character is prepared for leadership. And it's not mistakes, it's our response to mistakes that truly matters. It's the response to the mistakes. That's what God is watching out for. And that is what is the proof of the character of a leader. It is not the number of mistakes that we make. It's how we respond to those mistakes that God is looking out for. Wonderful example is here in John 21. Something that we sometimes don't realize is that Jesus can be a little sharp. Sometimes we think of him as a good shepherd, really nice, forgiving people, healing people, but sometimes he would actually tweak them. We talked about this with the Syrophoenician woman a few weeks ago. I will get to that sermon, I swear. I love that passage, we'll get to it. But he tweaks her. And he says that the gifts of God are for the children of God, not for the dogs. And he tweaks her to see what she'll do. And he also tweaks Peter here as well. Because you'll notice that 3 times he asks Peter, do you love me? And it's no accident. He doesn't do that accidentally as if, let me just make sure, right? Instead, he does that because Peter denied him 3 times. It was a linkage to those things. It was a parallel. In the same way that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus would say 3 times, do you love me? And that fact was not lost on Peter. The painful memory of that is not lost on Peter because we see in John 21:17 that he was pained by this. The first 2 times he was not because he didn't realize it. The first 2 times he thought, wow, interesting question. But when Jesus asked him the 3rd time, it all comes back to him. Essentially, he knows that Jesus is reminding him of his failure. He's reminding him of his failure. There's a couple of reasons why Jesus does this. And the first and most important reason is because restoration involves going through where you have been. To be restored and forgiven of something, you actually have to journey through what you did. And oftentimes we mistake forgetfulness with forgiveness. And we think the best kind of restoration in our lives is if someone never brings up our mistakes ever again. That's what we dream and pray for. God, just don't let me ever think about that again and I will feel restored. But that's not what restoration is in God's eyes. Restoration is not just, I'm not going to bring this up again. It's, I'm going to make you journey through that moment of failure so you can be truly restored of it. That's forgiveness. If you don't recognize sin, how could you be forgiven from it? And that's part of the reason why Jesus brings up Peter's failures, because in order for Peter to be fully restored, not just forgetfulness restored, but to be fully restored, he has to remember what went wrong. He has to remember the denial. And that's part of the reason he specifically brings it up, is for full restoration's sake. But I think part of the reason he does it is to see what Peter's going to do. Is to see what Peter's response, to measure what Peter will do as he digs him in this moment and recalls this failure. For many of us, I count myself in this number, I think I might not have had the same response as Peter. Right? Pride gets in the way, anger gets in the way, resentment. I can imagine myself in that situation if someone brings up a mistake that I've made, not just twice, but 3 times, just kind of getting mad. and saying rude, and just kind of turning away from that relationship. Right? Gosh, you had to say it 3 times? You could have just said it once and I would have gotten the point. I probably wouldn't have, but I would say that out loud. Right? And that's oftentimes, I think, our response, to get angry, to deny it and say, but I was doing this. And there's a reason to what I was doing. But look at what that other person was doing and how bad it was. Look at how none of the other disciples were even there, Jesus. The reason I denied you, and this is true, the reason Peter denies Jesus is because he was closer to Jesus on Good Friday than anyone else. The other disciples had actually fled by that moment. The reason why Peter was in a situation to be persecuted is because he followed Jesus more closely. Isn't that strange? He could have said that, couldn't he? He could have told Jesus, but Jesus, I was there. But he doesn't do that. Peter doesn't deflect. He doesn't run away from this moment. He doesn't get upset. Instead, what he says, he's hurt. And you can just sense that moment. Imagine if someone brought up something you had done wrong and that pain that you feel. But his response is, Jesus, you know that I love you. You can see into my heart right now. You don't even need to ask this question. And you know that I love you. He doesn't run from this moment. He doesn't deflect. He doesn't get angry. But he says, yes, I do love you. And he engages with this moment of rebuke. And he fully accepts it. And he learns from it. That's what makes Peter the leader that he is. It was not his absence of mistakes. It was not the fact that he never messed up. It was that when he messed up, he stood in that moment and he stood in it with Jesus. And he sought out that forgiveness and wouldn't turn away from it and continued to love Jesus, continued to approach Jesus. In fact, in the passage that precedes this, what we find is that when he sees Jesus on the shore, he's in a boat and he sees Jesus on the shore, he sees Jesus. Now, just imagine this for a moment. You see someone that you have messed up with, right? You've wronged them. What do you usually do when you see them across the street or in the hallway at work or in the hallways at home? Or you messed up. What do? You turn away and you say, oh, I didn't see them, even though they're right in front of me 5 feet away. You pretend, you get away, you run away. What it says in the earliest part of John 21 is that Peter takes off his clothes and he jumps into the lake and he swims towards Jesus. You see Peter's mentality? He doesn't run from this moment. He doesn't run from Jesus. He doesn't run even from the pain of that memory. He just wants to be close to him. And that's why he's a leader. It's because of that heart. It's because of a response to the mistakes, not the absence of them. Other wonderful example of this comes from King David. King David, in almost every way, makes a mistake far worse than Peter. If you know King David's life from 2 Samuel, it says that David essentially arranges for a man to be killed. He sends Uriah the Hittite into the front lines of battle, knowing that he will be killed, even though he's an honorable, loyal soldier, so that he can take his wife. If there is any mistake that would disqualify someone from ministry, it's something like that. Is there anything worse that a person can do? To conspire against someone else to steal their spouse? If anything that we would imagine would disqualify David from leadership, it would be that. So Nathan, the prophet, confronts Peter with this and comes up with this elaborate kind of parable about a person being robbed of justice. And David gets mad. He burns. He says, tell me who this man is so I can make sure justice is visited upon him. And Nathan says, it's you. You are that man because you sent Uriah the Hittite to die for your sake. And so you can steal his wife. And this is a terrible prophecy that he gives to him at this point. It says, now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. And this would come true. The sword would never leave David's house from that point on. The son that Bathsheba bore would die. The other son, Absalom, would try to usurp and kill his own father. The sword would never leave his life because of the violence that David invited into his life in this moment. And again, David's response could have done a number of things. He could have denied it and said, actually, you weren't there, so you don't even know what you're talking about. As the king of Israel, he could have had Nathan killed. No one would have blinked an eye. He is the king. Instead, his immediate response is, I have sinned against the Lord. There is no justification. There is no evasion. He writes amazing psalms that we still recite today. Create in me a clean heart. In response to this moment, he is broken up because of the mistake that he has made. Because of that, he is still allowed to be the king of Israel. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine making a mistake of that magnitude and still being allowed? And I just think about that for my own life. I think about what mistake could I make here that would not get me fired? And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I'm not going to do it. I'm just saying that I thought about it for a moment. But to think that in light of God's mercy, that it's not the mistake that pushed David out the door. His response to his mistake requalified him. It allowed him to remain in ministry and leadership despite the incredible thing that he had done wrong. Another kind of illustration of this is Samuel. Samuel, in my mind, makes a mistake that's far less terrible than either Peter or David. In the book of 1 Samuel, God and Samuel command Saul, the King Saul, to be God's wrath, essentially to destroy an entire area of every living thing. Essentially, you will be my disaster. You'll make everything devoted to me, to destruction. Everything must be destroyed. Saul, understandably, balks at this. Understandably says, wow. And he says, okay, well, some of the stuff is usable still. These goats, these sheep, I can still use. So he doesn't carry out the command. And he takes some of the precious things from that city and he retains it for himself. And Samuel confronts him with this. And Saul calls out, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ear? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" And after this follows a series of evasions where Saul basically says, "Oh, but I didn't do that because we still needed it. And I didn't know that this was going to happen." And he tries to evade Samuel in several ways. And finally, he admits to it. But he admits it to it in a very strange way, where he says, "It's true. I messed up. Please forgive me so that I can be presentable for worship. Please forgive me so that people will see me and they'll know that I'm straight." The only reason he wanted to be forgiven was his appearances before the people of Israel. And it's after that, it's the response to the mistake where Samuel says, no. It's not the mistake itself, but it's the response to the mistake where Samuel says, no, you can't. As of this point, the kingship has been taken away from you and someone else is going to have it. You see, Saul actually made several mistakes even before this, before 1 Samuel 15. And none of those times was he disqualified because of the mistakes. At no point did Samuel say, you checked off that box, you're done, sorry. It was because of this response, because he refused to learn, he refused to seek out forgiveness, he refused to sit in that space of repentance. That's what got him disqualified from that moment. This just all adds up to a really important element of leadership that we often forget, and that is this: that godly leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. Godly leaders are not the people who never make mistakes. Godly leaders are the ones who seek forgiveness from them and learn from the mistakes that they make. That's what leadership is. That's what we see in John 21. We don't see a perfect man becoming a leader. We see a man who makes dumb mistakes, but stays in a moment of repentance, asks for forgiveness, becoming a leader. That's what godly leadership is all about. I think it's a wonderful, difficult insight from John 21. The final relationship that I see between forgiveness and leadership that we get out of the reinstatement of Peter is that true leaders are true forgivers. Leaders are forgivers. Again, that is not necessarily the thing that we think about the best leaders. Think about the best leaders in your lives and the characteristics that you see in that people, in that person. Do you think about forgiveness? Do you think about forgiveness being a tool of leadership? And I would say many of us would say, no, that has nothing to do with leadership. Yeah, being a good Christian is part of forgiveness, right? But leadership is something separate. And yet here we see Jesus in his resurrected glory. No one has more authority and is a better leader than Jesus in John 21. And what he decides to do is to forgive Peter. A true leader, an eternal leader, being forgiving, being a forgiver. There's a temptation at this point, I think, to imagine that he does this out of the kindness of his heart. Nothing to do with leadership and leading Peter and giving Peter a new mantle. It's just a decision that he makes. He's compassionate. And he says, Peter, I'm going to let you go on that one. And that's why he decides to do it. It's compassion that drives forgiveness. But I think there's more to it. I think that Jesus does this on purpose. That for Jesus, forgiveness was the most effective leadership tool. It was a way that he led people. In order to understand why this is the case, we have to understand the relationship between leadership and transformation. Leadership and transformation. They'll seem like two different ideas, but I think they're more related than we think. Leadership, in essence, is the practice of transforming others and helping them become or do what they could not do otherwise. That's what being a leader is. If someone can do or be something already without your help, they don't need your leadership, right? If they can accomplish a goal by themselves, they don't need you. They don't need your leadership. The reason we need leaders is because we can't do something. The reason why we need someone to take our hand is because we cannot be something. And we need to be transformed into a person who could do or be those things. That's a crucial, fundamental part of leadership. Leadership is the ability to transform someone who can't do something or can't be something into a person who can do that or can be that. The best leaders have done that for each of us, right? Where we didn't feel like we could, and yet through their guidance, through their abilities, through their training, whatever it might be, we felt like we could afterwards. They transformed us. The best leaders are transformers of people who can get them to go from one state into another. That's the essence of leadership. And that's what Jesus would do as well. Jesus, part of his leadership style was to transform people. To get them to be or to do things they could never do on their own. And the main tool that he would use, the main tool of transformational leadership that he would use was forgiveness. It was the biggest hammer in his belt. We see that in today's passage. Peter, in John 20, 19 through 20, is a fool who brags about being better than anyone else and cannot even stand in the face of the questions of a camp girl in John 19 and John 20. And then by Acts chapter 1, he is the father of the early church. And the transformation takes place here in the forgiveness that he receives. The reason why he goes from John 19 into Acts chapter 1 is forgiveness. Forgiveness is what so profoundly transformed him and helped him to go and take that step. Forgiveness was a tool that Jesus used to say, Peter, do you love me? Let me restore you. That restoration was transformation. Forgiveness was what transformed him. Paul's life in the book of Acts, he goes from a murderous persecutor who smiled and approved as people were being stoned to death into being an evangelist. And the turning point is what he talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 1, where he says this: even though I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. The grace of our Lord was poured out on me abundantly, along with the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. The hinge point, the crux upon which the transformation of Paul takes place is the mercy of God. That's what made him different. That and being blinded on the road to, on the road. That's part of the process as well. But the bigger part of the process is grace. It's mercy. It's mercy that transformed Paul from being Saul into Paul. And what we see then is that mercy transforms people. Mercy is a tool of leadership that we see in Paul's life, we see in Peter's life, we see in our own. Let me ask you a rhetorical question. How many of us are here because of God's wrath? How many of us are here as believers, as followers of Jesus who came to church on Sunday when you could be at Starbucks right now because God got so mad at you and smacked you so hard up the head that that's why you're here today? You can metaphorically raise your hand if that's the case. How many of you are here because of God's mercy? Because of the message of the cross? Because you learned that Jesus loved you so much that he would die to forgive all your sins. And it was that mercy and that forgiveness that brought you here to this place. A person who sings songs and prays quietly or loudly and then listens to a person drone on and on for 30 minutes. What made you into that person? Was it wrath? Was it judgment? Was it rules? Or was it grace, mercy, and forgiveness? I would say for a lot of us who could not help but raise our hands in this moment, it was the grace that did it, right? The transformational tool in our lives that did the most profound transformation we've ever experienced came out of mercy and forgiveness. That the greatest tool of transformation that we have ever seen in our own lives is mercy. And that is what we need to realize, that Jesus uses mercy to lead others into transformation. Mercy and forgiveness is a leadership tool. If leadership is transformation, then forgiveness is its greatest tool. Where this hurts us, where this tweaks us is that we, so many of us, would probably come up on stage, testify out loud that the mercy of Jesus Christ has transformed us, and it has got us to go from a terrible place into a far better one, and on a road that continues on, where that sanctification, that improvement continues. And yet, despite the fact that we know this is the greatest tool of transformation we have ever seen, when we lead others, and we turn to our family, and we turn to coworkers, and we turn in our schools, in our community, we never use that tool. Instead, we use tools of judgment, and we use tools of, no one's going to get something on me. And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows, these are the rules, and you can't push me on them. We use judgment, and we use strength and legalism to try to transform others when we ourselves were transformed through mercy. And that is the paradox of leadership. That we have inherited from this world the idea of kingly leadership, worldly leadership, which is based on strength, which is based on violence, which is based on force, which is based on rules and legalism, when we in our own lives were transformed by mercy, grace, and forgiveness, which was undeserved. Isn't that the strangest thing? The strangest thing, that the power that transforms others, we don't utilize in our own lives. The challenge that I want to present to us this morning is this, is what would it look like for you to lead using forgiveness? What would it look like for parents? Man, that's a hard one. For parents, for you to lead your families, your spouses, not with, these are the rules, kid, and if you push me on it, you're gonna find out what's gonna happen. But instead to transform our children into the children that we want them to be by showing them mercy they've never seen before. What would that look like? The mercy that transformed us. What would it look like in our workplaces for us to be known as leaders of forgiveness and grace and mercy? Not like the bosses that we see everywhere else. In every modern media out there, what is the prototype of a boss? It's the exact opposite. For us to lead instead with forgiveness. What would it look like in our communities? For us to lead with grace instead of judgment. That's what I want you to consider in your lives, because we're all leaders. We're all leaders because we lead in some way. We all are part of the royal priesthood that has been created by the blood of Jesus. And here we are, transformed and led by forgiveness, and yet not using forgiveness in our own lives. That shouldn't be that way. Let us consider for a moment how we might lead with the same tool that transformed ourselves.